Chapter 6 Weavers, Iron Smelters and Factory Owners. This chapter tells the story of the crafts and industries of India during British rule by focusing on two industries, namely textiles and iron and steel. Both these industries were crucial for the industrial revolution in the modern world. Mechanized production of cotton textiles made Britain the foremost industrial nation in the 19th century, and when its iron and steel industry started growing from the 1850s, Britain came to be known as the workshop of the world. The industrialization of Britain had a close connection with the conquest and colonization of India. You have seen Chapter 2 how the English East India Company's interest in trade led to occupation of territory, and how the pattern of trade changed over the decades. In the late 18th century, the company was buying goods in India and exporting them to England and Europe, making profit through this sale. With the growth of industrial production, British industrialists began to see India as a vast market for their industrial products, and over time manufactured goods from Britain began flooding India. How did this affect India crafts and industries? This is the question we will explore in this chapter. Indian textiles and the world market. Let us first look at textile production around 1750. Before the British conquered Bengal, India was by far the world's largest producer of cotton textiles. Indian textiles had long been renowned both for their fine quality and exquisite craftsmanship. They were extensively traded in Southeast Asia, Java, Sumatra and Penang, and West and Central Asia. From the 16th century, European trading companies began buying Indian textiles for sale in Europe. Memories of this flourishing trade and the craftsmanship of Indian weavers is preserved in many words still current in English and other languages. It is interesting to trace the origin of such words and see what they tell us. Words tell us histories. European traders first encountered fine cotton cloth from India, carried by Arab merchants in Mosul in present-day Iraq. So they began referring to all finely woven textiles as muslin, a word that acquired wide currency when the Portuguese first came to India in search of spices. They landed in Calicut on the Kerala coast in southwest India. The cotton textile which they took back to Europe along with the spices came to be called calico, derived from Calicut, and subsequently calico became the general name for all cotton textiles. There are many other words which point to popularity of Indian textile in Western markets. In figure 3, you can see a page of an order book that the English East India Company sent to its representatives in Calcutta in 1730. The order that year was for 5,89,000 pieces of cloth. Browsing through the order book, you would have seen a list of 98 varieties of cotton and silk cloths. These were known by their common name in the European trade as piece goods, usually woven cloth pieces that were 20 yards long and 1 yard wide. Now look at the names of the different varieties of cloth in the book. Amongst the pieces ordered in bulk were printed cotton cloths called chinj, kosez or khasa and bandana. Do you know where the English term chinj comes from? It is derived from the Hindi word chink, a cloth with a small and colorful flowery design. From the 1680s, there started a craze for printed Indian cotton textiles in England and Europe, mainly for their exquisite floral designs, fine texture and relative cheapness. Rich people of England, including the Queen herself, wore cloths of Indian fabric. Similarly, the word bandana now refers to any brightly colored and printed scarf for the neck or head. Originally, the term derived from the word bandhana, Hindi for tying, and referred to a variety of brightly colored cloth produced through a method of tying and dyeing. There were other cloths in the order book that were noted by their place of origin: Kasim Bazar, Patna, Calcutta, Odisha, Charpur. The widespread use of such words shows how popular Indian textiles had become in different parts of the world. Indian textiles in European market. By the early 18th century, worried by the popularity of Indian textiles, wool and silk makers in England began protesting against the import of Indian cotton textiles. In 1720, the British government enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textile. Change. In England, interestingly, this act was known as the Calico Act. At this time, textile industries had just begun to develop in England. Unable to compete with Indian textiles, English producers wanted a secure market within the country by preventing the entry of Indian textiles. The first to grow under government protection was the calico printing industry. Indian designs were now imitated and printed in England on white muslin or plain unbleachable Indian cloth. Competition with Indian textiles also led to a surge for technological innovation in England. In 1764, the spinning jenny was invented by John Kay, which increased the productivity of the traditional spindles. The invention of the steam engine by Richard Arkwright in 1786 revolutionized cotton textile weaving. Cloth could now be woven in immense quantities and cheaply too. However, Indian textiles continued to dominate world trade till the end of the 18th century. European trading companies, the Dutch, the French, and the English, made enormous profits out of this flourishing trade. Wise companies purchased cotton and silk textiles in India by importing silver, but as you know, Chapter 2, when the English East India Company gained political power in Bengal, it no longer had to import precious metal to buy Indian goods. Instead, they collected revenues from peasants and zamindars in India and used the revenue to buy Indian textiles. Who were the weavers? Weavers often belonged to communities that specialized in weaving. Their skill were passed on from one generation to the next. The Tanti weavers of Bengal, the Julahas or Momin weavers of North India, Sel and Kaikolar and Devang of South India are some of the communities famous for weaving. The first stage of production was spinning, a work done mostly by women. The charkha and the takli were household spinning instruments. The thread was spun on the charkha and rolled on the takli. When the spinning was over, the thread was woven into cloth by the weaver. In most communities, weavers was a task done by men. For colored textiles, the thread was dyed by the dyer, known as rangrez. For printed cloth, the weavers needed the help of specialist block printers known as chipikars. Handloom weaving and the occupations associated with it provided livelihood for millions of Indians. The decline of Indian textiles. The development of cotton industries in Britain affected textile producers in India in several ways. First, Indian textiles now had to compete with British textile in the European and American markets. Second, exporting textiles to England also became increasingly difficult since very high duties were imposed on Indian textiles imported into Britain. By the beginning of the 19th century, English-made cotton textiles successfully outstayed Indian goods from their traditional markets in Africa, America and Europe. Thousands of weavers in India were now thrown out of employment. Bengal weavers were the worst hit. English and European companies stopped buying Indian goods and their agents no longer gave out advances to weavers to secure supplies. Distressed weavers wrote petitions to the government to help them, but worse was still to come. By the 1830s, British cotton cloth flooded Indian market. In fact, by the 1880s, two-thirds of all the cotton cloths worn by Indians were made of cloth produced in Britain. This affected not only specialist weavers but also spinners. Thousands of rural women who made a living by spinning cotton thread were rendered jobless. Handloom weaving did not completely die in India. This was because some types of cloth could not be supplied by machines. How could machines produce saris with intricate borders or cloths with traditional woven patterns? These had a wide demand not only amongst the rich but also amongst the middle classes. Nor did the textile manufacturers in Britain produce the very coarse cloth used by the poor people. You must have heard of Solapur in western India and Madurai in South India. These towns emerged as important new centers of weaving in the late 19th century. Later, during the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi urged people to boycott imported textiles and use hand-spun and hand-woven cloth. Khadi gradually became a symbol of nationalism. The charkha came to represent India and it was put at the center of the tricolor flag of the Indian National Congress adopted in 1931. What happened to the weavers and spinners who lost their livelihoods? Many weavers became agricultural laborers. Some migrated to cities in search of work and yet others went out of the country to work in plantations. In Africa and South America, some of these handloom weavers also found work in the new cotton mills that were established in Bombay, now Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Solapur, Nagpur, and Kanpur. Cotton mills come up. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in 1854. From the early 19th century, Bombay had grown as an important port for the export of raw cotton from India to England and China. It was close to the vast black soil tract of western India where cotton was grown. When the cotton textile mills came up, they could get supplies of raw materials with ease. By 1900, over 84 mills started operating in Bombay. Many of these were established by Parsi and Gujarati businessmen who had made their money through trade with China. Mills came up in other cities too. The first mill in Ahmedabad was started in 1861. A year later, a mill was established in Kanpur in the United Provinces. Growth of cotton mills led to a demand for labor. Thousands of poor peasants, artisans, and agricultural laborers moved to the cities to work in the mills. In the first few decades of existence, the textile factory industry in India faced many problems. It found it difficult to compete with the cheap textiles imported from Britain. In most countries, governments supported industrialization by imposing heavy duties on imports. This eliminated competition and protected infant industries. The colonial government in India usually refused such protection to local industries. The first major spurt in the development of cotton factory production in India, therefore, was during the First World War, when textile imports from Britain declined and Indian factories were called upon to produce cloths for military supplies. The sword of Tipu Sultan and Uj steel. We begin the story of Indian steel and iron metallurgy by recounting the famous story of Tipu Sultan, who ruled Mysore till 1799, fought 4 wars with the British and died fighting with his sword in his hand. Tipu's legendary sword are now part of valuable collections in a museum in England. But do you know why the sword was so special? The sword had an incredibly hard and sharp edge that could easily rip through the opponent's armor. This quality of the sword came from a special type of high carbon steel called wood, which was produced all over South India. Wood steel, when made into sword, produced a very sharp edge with a flowing water pattern. This pattern came from very small carbon crystal embedded in the iron. Francis Buchanan, who toured through Mysore in 1800, a year after Tipu Sultan's death, has left us an account of the technique by which wood steel was produced in many hundreds of smelting furnaces in Mysore. In these furnaces, iron was mixed with charcoal and put inside small clay pots. Through an intricate control of temperature, the smelters produced steel ingots that were used for sword making not just in India but in West and Central Asia too. Wood steel, Anglicized version of the Kannada word ukku, Telugu hukku, and Tamil and Malayalam urukku, meaning steel. Indian wood steel fascinated European scientist Michael Faraday. The legendary scientist and discoverer of electricity and electromagnetism spent 4 years studying the properties of Indian wood, 1818 to 22. However, the wood steel making process, which was so widely known in South India, was completely lost by the mid-19th century. Can you guess why this was so? The sword and armor making industry died with the conquest of India by the British, and imports of iron and steel from England displaced the iron and steel produced by craftspeople in India. Abundant furnaces in villages. Production of wood steel required a highly specialized technique of refining iron, but iron smelting in India was extremely common till the end of the 19th century. In Bihar and central India in particular, every district had smelters that used local deposits of ore to produce iron, which was widely used for manufacture of implements and tools of daily use. The furnaces were most often built of clay and sun-dried bricks. The smelting was done by men while women worked the bellows, pumping air that kept the charcoal burning. By the late 19th century, however, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. In most villages, furnaces fell into disuse and the amount of iron produced came down. Why was this so? One reason was the new forest laws that you have read about Chapter 4. When the colonial government prevented people from entering the reserved forest, how could the iron smelters find wood for charcoals? Where could they get iron ore? Defying forest laws, they often entered the forest secretly and collected wood, but they could not sustain their occupation on the basis for long. Many gave up their craft and looked for other means of livelihood. In some areas, the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for many furnaces they used. This reduced their income. Moreover, by the late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. Ironsmiths in India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. This inevitably lowered the demand for iron produced by local smelters. By the early 20th century, the artisans producing iron and steel faced a new competition. Iron and steel factories came up in India. The year was 1904. In the hot month of April, Charles Weld, an American geologist, and Dorabji Tata, the eldest son of Jamsetji Tata, were traveling in Chhattisgarh in search of iron ore deposits. They had spent many months on a costly venture looking for source of good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Jamsetji Tata had decided to spend a large part of his fortune to build a big iron and steel industry in India, but this could not be done without identifying the source of fine quality iron ore. One day, after traveling for many hours in the forest, Weld and Dorabji came upon a small village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. These people were the agrarians. When asked where they had found the iron ore, the agrarians pointed to a hill in the distance. Weld and Dorabji reached the hill after an exhausting trek through dense forest. On exploring the hill, the geologist declared that they had at least found what they had been looking for. Rajra Hills had one of the finest ore in the world, but there was a problem. The region was dry and water necessary for running the factory was not to be found nearby. The Tatas had to continue their search for a more sustainable place to set up their factory. However, the agrarians helped in the discovery of a source of iron ore that would later supply the Vilai and steel plant. A few years later, a large area of forest was cleared on the banks of the river Suvarnarekha to set up the factory and an industrial township, Jamshedpur. Here there was water near iron ore deposits. The Tata Iron and Steel Company TISCO that came up began producing steel in 1912. TISCO was set up at an opportune time. All through the late 19th century, there was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Expansion of the railways in India had provided a huge market for rail that Britain produced. For a long while, British experts in the Indian railways were unwilling to believe that good quality steel could be produced in India. By the time TISCO was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of war in Europe, so imports of British steel into India declined dramatically and the Indian railways turned to TISCO for supply of rails. As the war dragged on for several years, TISCO had to produce rails and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by TISCO. Over time, TISCO became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. In the case of iron and steel, as in the case of cotton textiles, industrial expansion occurred only when British imports into India declined and the market for Indian industrial goods increased. This happened during the First World War and after. As the nationalist movement developed and the industrial class became stronger, the demand for government protection became louder. Struggling to retain its control over India, the British government had to concede many of these demands in the last decades of colonial rule.